Okay, we're going to be talking about splitting Agile stories, theory and practice. So go to the Slido link if you can, and here's a couple questions for you. Why might you want to split a user story? So what's a reason you might want to split a user story into two smaller stories?
The story might be too large.
Right, might be too large. I see some answers here to fit into a sprint, to estimate size. Story's too big, too complex. Yeah, so these are all great reasons you might want to split a story. Although the one of trying to make it fit into a sprint, I'm going to suggest is probably not the best reason. There may be reasons that are better than just trying to make it fit in a sprint. Okay, another question for you. Who and your team, who is most in favor of splitting user stories on your team? So who do you have that's most gung-ho about splitting user stories? For people that don't have the link, I'm sorry, the place I have the link I cannot paste from. But if you go to slido.com and just type in that number, that will get you hooked up where the link is. Sorry about that. Okay, who's most in favor? It looks like we've got developers 45%, Scrum Masters, business, management, quality assurance. Okay, so I think it's interesting we're more on the Scrum Masters, and this might be to try to fit it into the sprint, followed by the developers. I would suggest that a team that's really doing well, everybody should be very much in favor of trying to split stories. That takes a while to get to, but the teams I've seen that have really kind of grabbed onto this, it's a group effort because it takes what everyone knows in order to get to the point that that you can really be efficient at splitting stories down. Okay, so why split stories? So one reason you'll hear a lot is to fit in the sprint. And I would question whether that's the best reason to try to fit a story. If you are splitting stories down small, they likely will fit into a sprint, but that may not be the best reason for driving splitting the stories. This is what I like to encourage teams to think about, that if we split a story, it gives us the ability to deliver something before we deliver everything. So we can deliver part of a story before we deliver all of the story. And that really aligns us with our Agile principles, right? We've got our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. This implies that we want to deliver something before we deliver everything, right? It should be early and it should be continuous and it should be valuable. So this is a really good principle to go back to when you're trying to figure out how can we better split stories, going back and saying, okay, how do we make sure we're satisfying the customer, we're giving them something that they want. So it means it's got to be something they can see from their perspective. We want continuous delivery, meaning we're going to keep delivering things, and it should be valuable, whatever we're giving them. Working software is the primary measure of progress. If we want to show continual progress, we have to be able to deliver in small units, not just these huge kind of, oh, here's everything, we threw it over the fence to you, and 6 months later we're going to throw a bunch of other stuff over the fence to you. That's a really bad way to, if we're measuring progress by working software, that's not how we want to be deploying stuff. Deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with a preference to the shorter time scale. And I would say that back when this was written, a couple of weeks was really, really fast. Nowadays, if we're actually saying we're preferring a shorter time scale, I think we have capabilities of delivering even more frequently today. Yes, has to work. Welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. If we want to welcome changing requirements, we really need to get things into the customer's hands so they know what would need to be changed. If we just take all the requirements and then we're going to work for 6 months or a year and then give the customer exactly what they asked for, there's a pretty good chance that exactly what they asked for is not really what they want once they actually get it and start looking at it. So there's this idea of this, that the requirements may change as we move through things. If we're able to get feedback, we're giving software and we're getting back information, this is a lot easier to do to harness the change for the customer's competitive advantage. Okay, so let's look at this. What if we want to deliver half of the value? So we've got a big story here, right? It's big, it delivers lots of value, and it will take a lot of time to deliver. So what if we wanted to deliver half the value in half the time, right? We don't want to deliver this big story, and we're going to assume that this story is evenly distributed through everything that's there, right? If we could cut the value in half, we can cut the time in half. And I want you to notice something. If we look at this, so imagine in your mind, how would you actually cut this in half? Well, we might think we're going to do this, right? We're going to cut it in half, and then we're going to have this, we're going to get rid of this part right here. But what we've done here is now we're delivering the full amount of the value in half the time. Okay, and that looks great, right? Well, let's just keep cutting it in half again, and again and again, and pretty soon we can deliver all the value of this story in 0 time. Well, that probably indicates we're not cutting this right. There's something that we're not, there's some aspect of this that where we're not actually, this isn't how we would cut this story in half the value in half the time. Well, what if we cut it this way? So if we cut it in half this way, now we're delivering half the value in the full amount of time. Well, that's obviously not what we want to do. Now it's taking the full amount of time and we're only getting half the value. So the point I wanted to show you here is that when we think about cutting stories in half the value, half the time, neither of these lines actually lets us do that. What we really need to do is cut at half the time and half the value, which means we're cutting out this here, and that over there. So now we're down here. This is half the value and half the time. So this, now, if we come back and we say, okay, this delivers half the value and half the time, now let's deliver the other half the value and half the time. Okay, so there would be the other half the value and half the time. Now this looks really strange. Like, what in the world was the stuff in all this area here? Like, what was that? We've now changed our graph to where we're not covering as much area. And is this just a weird thing of graph, or is there something that was actually occupying that space that we've somehow gotten rid of? So that's a question for you in Slido. What do you think is actually in that area? What's this area that's missing now? Is it management overhead, waste from inefficiencies, waiting for work, cost of delay, slack, or buffer? And it's not that there's a right or wrong answer here. I'm just, what do you is your gut feel of what belongs in that area there? Is that going to give us feedback as we go? Maybe it doesn't. I'll go get a few more people on there. I'm trying to find a good way to get that link in there for you. Sorry about that. I should have had that earlier. Okay, well, I guess we'll just have to get into it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so let's see what everybody thinks here. Oops. Everyone said, like I said, Slido's new to me, so I may not be doing this quite right. Oh, okay. Well, you get to choose, and I don't get to see what the answers were. That's interesting. Okay, cool. Anyway, the point was to mainly think about what would be there, and I would submit that what's happening actually there is delay. Oh, thank you, Shelley, for putting that link in there. That's awesome. I'm not seeing the answers either. Like I said, this is an experiment with Slido, and it's not evidently going to let me see what the answers are, which is disappointing. Okay, well, I was curious what that would turn out with. But all of these are things that you might say were things that were happening in there. I would suggest that what's actually happening here is some type of delay, right? We've got this delay up here where we're waiting for capacity. So we're not able to start, if we're doing the whole story all together, we're not able to start on this part right here. Oh, my hand disappears right there. That's interesting. Okay. We're not able to start on that work because we're waiting for the capacity that's being spent on this work down here, if we're just doing all the story together. And this delay over here, if we finish that part of it, is waiting for this to be deployed. If we do this all together, then we've got that delay in there. But if we're able to actually deliver that first half and then move on to the second half, we can basically remove that delay to where we're able to, one, we're not waiting for this story because we're not going to start it till we've actually got capacity. And this story we split things into down here, we're able to actually deploy it, so we're not waiting for deployment. So half the story is actually, if we look at that big story, half of that time, or half of what goes into that, is actually spent waiting. Well, now watch this. What if we were to do this? All right, what if we take each of those stories and find some way to split them up? Let's say it's something that we can split those things up. So define capacity. What I mean is that we have work that we're wanting to do, that if we focus all of our efforts on one half of it, here, let me go back to this. if we're doing this whole story, and if we're able to split the story up and half the value takes half the time to produce, then that means that we were working in a way to where if we put all of our focus into just that first part, that first half of the story, we can deliver that and have that done before we start on the second part. So when I say capacity, what I mean is there's a way to finish part of this sooner than trying to finish all of it. So there's more capacity for that. People can deliver that first half before they deliver the rest of it. What's going to be happening if we do that big story all together is, one, we could be working just like this and just not, just waiting to start on this one and then waiting to deploy on this part of it. But what may be happening, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, is we may just have people that are, we may just be slowing ourselves down or working more slowly on both parts of this story. Good question. Okay, so over here, let's look at this. If we were to take each of those stories and split those, now we might be able to do something like this. So if these stories are able to be split up like this, now 75% of the effort that was going into 75% of the time to deliver this overall big story was actually spent waiting. Now this is, when I first started experiencing this on teams, this was really a big, this was a big surprise to me of how much time was actually just spent waiting, either waiting to deploy or waiting to start working on something, or where we needed to get other stuff because we had batched so many things together. I put this in here and my wife was like, that's really going to date you. It's going to make you look old. But I did it anyway. So what if splitting stories, the other piece of this is if we do split stuff up like this, what if splitting stories lets us find a part that we can skip? And we say, hey, you know what? We split this up in the way, it turns out this piece right up here, we had as part of the requirements, but it turns out that's not really that important to the user. Once we split it out and separate it from everything else, they said, yeah, let's not do that. We'll either defer it or maybe we never need to do it, but it's lower priority than other stuff we could be working on. Which brings us back to simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential, right? This is exactly the type of thing that we want to be able to experience, where we've broken our work up in a way that lets us maximize the amount of work that we didn't have to do. So here's a question for you. How often have you found a way to lower scope by splitting a story? Is that not giving us our options here? Let me bring this up to see. Well, I'm finding lots of bugs in Slido. Okay, so I can't remember what the options actually were here. Hopefully you can see them. Oh, that's right. Okay, so 1 is never and 5 is many times each month. And it sounds like most of us are kind of in between that. We are getting to do it, but not many times per month. So imagine if you were able to do that, though. Other question I should have asked is, how often does the scope of your stories grow when you get into it? When you get a team to the point that they're all looking at trying to find ways to split stories, you can get to the point where your scope is actually going down, or at least staying even instead of going up. And that's a very, very powerful thing in trying to make sure that your projects actually get completed and deliver something on time. Projects I've been on that were not good at splitting the story scope often end up getting canceled because the scope just naturally grows and grows and grows. Because when you've got that big story, I'll show you in a minute, it's really easy to try to fit more stuff in. So having been on some projects that were quoted with 50 developers and probably wouldn't have made it, but were actually done with like 5 to 7 developers in 20% less time than was being quoted, it's because of stuff like this. And it's this type of ability, getting your team set up to where you can break things down into smaller pieces and can cancel them, is what lets you see situations where 5 devs can out-deliver 50 devs. There's overhead and other things involved with that, but this is a key part of being able to have a high-performing team. So why split stories? Is it to try to fit into a sprint? I'd say that's probably not the main reason you should be trying to do it. You should be trying to do it because if we focus on trying to deliver something before we deliver everything, it's going to be much more efficient. So if you look at this example here, what happens to all that space? Well, it can end up being filled with unnecessary work. And what happens to all this space? This is waiting to actually provide value. If we split up the small stories, we also can reorder when they are delivered. Now, in the example here, we're saying these are all the same amount of value, take the same amount of time, but that's probably not going to be true, right? This is an idealized situation. If we actually start breaking stuff up and say that this is more valuable than this and takes more time, we can start shifting things around in order to deliver a lot more value a lot more quickly. Once we deliver these stories, we now get to a situation where the customer can start getting value from it. Remember, if we're looking at that whole thing, the customer doesn't get value from it till we get over here. If we can deliver part of that, we're going to start getting value from it, start getting value from it, start getting value from it. Even if the value is the customer looking at it, trying and saying, yeah, that's exactly what I asked for, but it's not what I want. We need to do this now. Stories grow for us. Sometimes wait time occurs while working on stories. Yeah, good comments. Okay, so when was the last time you heard someone on the team say, we better do this now because we will need it later to justify expanding the scope? Have you heard that today? Has it been sometime this week, this month, or have you never heard that? So this is something that it's a very easy habit to fall into of if we got to do this now because we might need it later. This is what kills projects, right? This is a big part of what kills projects, of trying to do something just a little bit more instead of what we should be thinking of, how do I deliver something valuable today so I can work on the next most important thing? If we're saying this, we better do this now because we will need it later, chances are what we should be hearing when people say that, and what we need to try to shift that conversation to, is that we are choosing to prioritize something that we have not defined as the most important thing we could work on next. We're doing, and maybe we do need it later, but the point we should be working on it is when it's the next most important thing we could be working on. If it's not the next most important thing we could be working on, then we should not be working on it, because we're now working in a way that's at odds with our goal of trying to make the project successful. Teams overestimate the value of avoiding future changes. So it's really easy, and this is one big shift. This is one thing I really love when coaching Agile teams, is when we get to this shift that they stop doing this and start understanding that the value of being able to evolve the software and get feedback quickly is much, much more valuable than trying to think in terms of, oh, I wrote this line of code and I never want to have to touch it again. When you can get that mindset shifted, when you can get that mindset shifted, teams can start really becoming powerhouses of being able to deliver. And it's a really cool feeling when you see teams start doing that. Okay, so I see what I was doing here. Okay, teams overestimate the value of avoiding future changes and underestimate the value of getting something into the hands of the customer. Dramatically underestimate the value of getting something into the hands of the customer. When you get something in the hands of the customer, you're now getting feedback. The longer you wait to do that, the more you can do things that aren't needed or head in the wrong direction or do exactly what the customer said that turns out to not to be what they want. So we often dramatically underestimate the value of getting something into the hands of the customer. Okay, here's another thing I've heard on some teams. It's kind of interesting. If we don't do this now, we'll never get around to doing it. Have you ever heard your team say this, or have you never heard this one before? And this is a really interesting statement. If we don't do this now, we'll never get around to it. Because it's usually done as a way of justifying doing whatever this is that they want to do. But it should be something so easy to say, if we don't do this now, we'll never get around to it. That should be an indication that this is never going to be the most important thing we could be working on, which means we should never do this, right? If there's never a point where this will be the next most highest priority that everyone agrees we should be working on, then why in the world? This should be a reason not to do it, not a reason to try to slip it in and do it. But this is a way that scope often grows. And I'm happy for the 11% of you that have never heard this before. That's awesome. But this is often something that's used to justify trying to fit something in that really is not the next most important priority. If it is something that is the next most important priority, then it's very clear. We should be doing this. This is the next thing to try to do. So watch out for this. This is a way of trying to slip more stuff in, and a way that story scope can end up growing. say, if we don't do this now, we'll never get around to it, and we just add one more thing to the story, and you end up with situations, teams that are really trying. Teams where you hear this a lot often get in situations where no story ever gets delivered because there's always something else to add, which is the exact opposite. Instead of splitting stories, we're making stories bigger and bigger and bigger, and they snowball to the point that they can never actually be delivered. Okay, so now, how to split stories. So we're going to take a little bit of a shift here and look at, we talked about, hopefully, actually give me a thumbs up. Do you see the value of splitting stories, which is probably why you're here in the first place, right? You see value in it? It's something that would be valuable? Okay, so now we're going to look at some techniques of how to actually split the stories up. But we're going to take a brief intermission and look at just a few things here. I want to let you know that coming up next week, Dave Marsh is going to be talking, I'm covering his face, is going to be talking about making success possible in our complex world. I'm really excited about this talk. I've worked with Dave in the past. Some of the most successful teams I've worked on have been teams that Dave was involved in. So I'm very excited about hearing this. So I encourage you to come to that. The week after that, we're going to talk about Agile, identifying double agents, counter espionage for Agile teams. We're going to look at some stuff, British counterintelligence in World War II, how that looked, and how would you identify if somebody on your team was being a double agent? Like, might they come in and say things like, if we don't do this now, we'll never get around to it, as ways of justifying things that will cause the project to fail. Maybe. So that's something we're going to talk about. And then the week after that, we're going to be doing, I just tested this out this morning to make sure the robots still work. I'm going to be walking you through a workshop that I do with teams. I usually come in and give everybody pairs up with a robot, and we go through and do behavior-driven development. Did this with Jeff Braxton one time in San Francisco, had a lot of fun with it. I've done it some other places, but I'm going to be doing that, and I'll have the robot. Sorry, I'm not going to ship everybody robots, but we're going to be working with a programming language that looks like this, a blocky programming language. So even if you're not a developer, it should let you kind of experience and see all the different aspects of how everything comes together in BDD scenario. Of creating a scenario and then doing the development work and stuff. So anyway, that should be a lot of fun. I'm gonna have a document camera set up so we can watch the robot drive around and stuff. Anyway, it's gonna be cool. Let's see. Oh, okay. So, yeah. So which invite do you plan to forward to a friend? So we got all these invites. I think you can select more than one. Which one are you planning to forward to a friend when you get it? And we'll be sending some of these out here in just a minute. And I'm having you do this to kind of prime you to commit to forwarding these on if you've got any team members that would benefit from any of these things. Okay, very cool. It looks like a lot of people are very interested in the BDD with robots, so I'm looking forward to that. These all are going to be a lot of fun here. I'm kind of disappointed, though, that 42% of you say that Agile Lunch and Learns are your secret weapon that you're not going to share with anyone. Okay. Lucas, you were forwarded the invite. You should have it in your... you'll get an invite after this for the next one. If you typed in your email address, you'll get the ones that are coming. Is this being recorded? Yes, it's being recorded. It'll be up on the Agile Lunch and Learn thing. By the way, if you look over here on the side of your where you go to Slido, there should be some links to the Agile Lunch and Learn YouTube page, so you can go there as well. Also, I've been meeting with people from the Agile Lunch and Learn community. It's been great. Got to talk to a lot of people. If you go to the Slido thing where I told you, I've still got some time for the next 3 days on my calendar that I kind of blocked off for meeting with people from the Agile Lunch and Learn community. So if you'd like to talk about Agile things you're dealing with, if you want to talk about ideas for how to improve the Lunch and Learn, or things that have been really helpful to you, or dog training techniques, or pretty much anything, grab 30 minutes on there, and I would love to talk to you about any of those topics. Or pretty much any topic. So love to talk to anybody. This has been really cool. Got to meet a lot of people so far, and we've got some time slots left. Okay, how to split stories. That was our brief intermission. Okay, so if we start thinking in terms of what is the smallest thing that the customer would perceive as being valuable, the smallest thing that the customer would say, yes, this is a step forward in what I want the application to grow into. So here's some ideas. So we could set up the database, we could code the back end, we could create a framework, or we could display the app's title. there's only one thing on this list. I should have done this as Slido, but I did it before I was trying that out. There's only one thing on this list that is actually going to be perceived as progress for the customer. Setting up the database isn't something the customer can interact with. And while they might be very happy you did it, it's not something they can look at the application and say, yes, this is a step forward. Coding the backend. They can't, if it's not something they interact with, they're not going to be able to actually see it as a step forward. Doesn't mean we're not going to do it, but we want to deliver things in a way that lets them actually see the value that we're providing with them. Creating a framework that's going to really help with everything else. It might be really valuable, and we may even want to do that, but that's not the same thing as a story that actually displays value to the user. Displaying the app's title, as silly as it sounds, is from the customer's standpoint. That's actually something the customer can try and say, yes, I see the app's title is showing there. And while that might seem so simple we wouldn't want to do it, to actually deploy the base application and show the application's title can take a lot of work. If you're setting it up, you can deploy it through CI/CD in the cloud or whatever that looks like. So the reason I want to bring these things out here is one important thing is if you say this story is too simple, then prove it's too simple and get it done really, really quickly. You can get it done quickly and then move on to the next story. That's not a bad thing. But chances are a lot of things that you think are going to be really simple, particularly in the very early stages of an application developing something, are going to be a lot more complicated than you realize. So here's a picture of a cake, and we tend to think of applications have different layers, right? We got the stuff up here at the top that's going to be things like the UI that they work with, and maybe there's a business layer here, and there's a database, and then there's the hardware, and maybe the infrastructure in the cloud at the bottom. We can approach these in two ways, right? We can try to deliver things where we're going with slices all the way through, or we can try to deliver layers. It's really easy to get to the point that we're trying to deliver these layers. But if we try to deliver layers, we remove ourselves from being able to actually deliver stuff and demonstrate it to the customer. We really want to be able to do something all the way through the customer can experience and that they can see as progress. So let's look at some examples of splitting stories. So this was a client we're working with, and we were building a customer portal for printing. So they have a bunch of people that work with them to leverage their printing presses, and those people are selling to end customers, and they would come into the portal and be able to make orders of all these different printing supplies and stuff, things like printing hotel cards and stuff like that. So they said they needed the customers to be able to modify orders, because sometimes customers are coming in, these customers were coming in, putting stuff in, and then finding out something wasn't right, and they needed to modify it in the system. So these were the things that they said were the acceptance criteria that they said it needed to do. Customers needed to be able to change orders, admins needed to get notifications of those changes, and then admins needed to be able to approve the changes. So of these three things, how do you think the customer would have prioritized these options? So these are the three things they wanted. What do you think is you should be able to rank these in terms of priority? So what's the most important one down to the least important one? I'm skimming back through the chat. Did you guys fill that out? Okay, and I'm going to throw a link in right here. There's a link to the calendar time if you guys want to grab some time on that. Okay, so let's see what we ended up with here. Okay, customer can change orders, change notifications, and then admin approval. And yes, that's exactly what, when we talked to them about it, that's what they came up with. So we had this big medium value story of we need to change orders and the associated workflows. When we asked them to try to break it up and prioritize things in the different parts, they said, really notifying the admin change is pretty low value. That's not something that we want it. It's very, very important, but it's not the highest priority of what we need here. Admin approval of the workflow is a little bit more important, because we need to make sure the admins are saying these are the things that we know this has happened and we're approving it. But letting the user change the order was the most important. That had the highest value. So what we did is we actually built it in this order, right? First, we set it up so the user could change the order, and they went in and tested and said, yes, this works well. The user can change the order now. And if I remember right, we actually deployed this to production so they could start using it. Then we fast followed with letting the admin approve the workflow. So once they had the ability to change it, we now had a place where the admin could go in and see, here's everything that's changed, and then click on it to approve them. Then once we got to the point that was working, the next thing we did that was a lot lower, and I believe, if I remember the exact situation, there were a couple other things they asked for before we did this piece of it. Because once we had done this, we had the really high value stuff out of the way, and this was lower value than the other things that they were asking for. But eventually we got it set up to where when the user makes a change, it then notifies the admin of the change, and then they're able to go in and approve the workflow. So this was a simple example of what we started with as one big story, need change orders and have the workflow associated with it. We were able to break that story up into 3 pieces and deliver them incrementally. So we got feedback from the user on how it was working. And we were able to fit other stuff right in here because this became a lot lower priority once it was separated from everything else over here. So that's one thing we did. Another example, internet announcements. So this was for a large internet site, and they needed a way to put a banner across the top that would say, here's, this was during COVID time too, but information about that. And they had a very, very nice plan of what they wanted to do. That shouldn't be there, whoops. Very nice plan of what they were wanting to be able to do. They wanted to be able to post a number of announcements with dates that they would go on and off. They wanted a different announcement priorities. So like a red one would be emergency, and that would get priority showing over a orange that was lower, which had more priority over green that was just going to be informational. And they wanted to rotate through the announcements. So if you went to the website, if you had already seen the higher priority one, it would rotate to another one and make sure you see everything before you see any of them again. So the business analysts that put this together did a great job of detailing everything that they wanted that they saw would be valuable about this. So once again, we had these huge announcements on the internet site story that they wanted. And developers were looking at this and saying, this may take 6 weeks. There's a lot of stuff in here of keeping track who had seen what and things like that. But then we started breaking it up. And we said, okay, what's the most valuable thing right now? And said, what if we were able to just give you a box that if you type something in, it would show up as an announcement on the site. Show a single announcement. And then we can come back and deal with rotating the announcements. And then after that, maybe the scheduling announcements. Well, and that's how they prioritized it. They said, you know what, if we could show a single announcement, that would get 90% of the value of this if we can put an announcement up there. Because we can manually schedule the announcements if we need to. And the rotating announcements, while we really, really want it, if we can show one thing, a lot of times we're only going to have one thing on there anyway. So that's really, really valuable to us. So this was something, instead of being 6 to 8 weeks, the developers said, we can do this overnight. We can have this in tomorrow or maybe the next day, we can have this set up because this is really, really simple. So they were able to deliver that. And what was interesting is when we came back to the conversation, they said, these other things we really, really want, but this was so valuable and got so much of the value of what we were asking for, we're going to defer these other things for a while because we've got this other story that we want to work on, and let's see if we can find a way to do the most valuable part of that. So those are the types of conversations that are so valuable when you're working with teams, and you can bring the business and the developers and QA and the product ownership all together and figure out what's the piece of this that's the most valuable, and then defer the stuff that's less valuable. Now, maybe the next most valuable thing is rotating the announcements or whatever that is, but you won't know, and you don't have that option unless you're able to split the story up. Okay, now I want to point out, did we just find a pattern here? So we've looked at a few examples, and if you notice, when we need to do one or more things, we can start out by building just that one thing. So we had the example here of the internet site. Did we want to have just the internet site? We wanted to display lots of information on there, but we found if we could just do one, we could get 90% of the value and deliver that all the way through. So let's look at another example of this. So we're trying with this idea of when you've got more than one thing to do, if there's a way to just build one, you may find you can stop there, but you can at least get the value from, you can at least get the value sooner. I'm sorry, I saw a chat message and got distracted. You can at least get the value of that and the feedback on it sooner. So if you've seen some of my other talks, talk about a customer needs to be able to sell shoes online or or I'm sorry, you're building software to sell shoes online. The customer needs to be able to order shoes, plural, okay? We want customers to be able to order shoes. If we think back to this idea of we want to deliver multiple things, what happens if we set up first just to deliver one? Can we make it so they can order just one pair at a time? Now, it's not what we want in the end, right? We want a shopping cart and all that stuff, but this might not be a bad starting place. So what would that look like? Well, maybe it looks like this. We've got all these different types of shoes, and you click to order the type of shoe you want. And then you type in the size and the name and the address and the credit card and place the order. So that's very, very simple approach to the idea of selling shoes. Now, this might not be what we want, and it might not even be something that we want to actually take live, although this would be functional where you could take it live. But it does give you the ability to deliver something for the customer, let them start using it, go through the flow, and it might have a big impact on how you decide to deal with multiple orders when people want to order multiple shoes. So this pattern of saying if you need to do multiple things, try to find a way to just do one. And in getting that to work, right, we're going to have to set up the web application, find some way to get inventory in. We're going to have to deal with credit card processing, and we're going to have to deal with the shipping. I mean, there's lots of stuff that goes into just that very, very simple thing. Allocating funds by percentages. So imagine a system. This is from a system I worked on here a while back. Imagine you've got a system like your 401k. So you're going to be putting money into, you put money in every week, and you need it to be allocated with 60% going to stocks and 40% to bonds or an ETF or whatever it is. You've got all these things. So you might have something like this. So this is ye old 401k, right? And we want to be able to put in different percentages and then the stock or the fund that it's going into, and have many of these and make sure that it totals to 100. And if they try to do a total that is more than 100%, it doesn't let you actually save the allocation and stuff. So there's lots of logic that has to happen on this page. Well, if we look at if we go back and kind of think in terms of our pattern here, I see there are many things here. So what would happen if we started just with one, right? And our first story is to get this working with just one stock that you can put out there. Now, we might not want to take that all the way to live prod, but getting this to work into a working state that the customer can go through and say, yes, the overall flow works, and we're able to do this with the stocks, and whatever has to happen as part of that can be a very valuable way to slice a story down to something that's smaller. Now we have options for what we want to do next, right? We've got this story and it's working. Do we now want to work on the percentage allocation? Or maybe it would be more valuable to work on the stock purchase processing part. Maybe we've got the ability to demonstrate that. Maybe that would be what we'd want to do next. We also might want to do security testing or performance or a host of other things. And we might find that, hey, this is so important. Once we've got just this piece working that we can deploy, we're going to start getting our security testing, because if security tells us that what our whole approach to programming isn't secure, we may want to know that before we build out a bunch of other stuff. So when we need to do one or more things, start by trying to build one thing and then evolve from there. So this should get us thinking, are there other patterns that might exist? And I'm going to look at some, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're going to look at some other patterns here, but what I really want to encourage you to do is to find the patterns that work in your situation and start looking for how you can find those in others. If you find a way to split a story, kind of back up from it and say, okay, we were able to split this story because we had many things and we just did the first one and then we're doing the others. And then try to find ways to apply that pattern to the other stories that you're running into. Can you do a story with simplified data? So for example, let's say we want to create a user in some type of system. This is an example from a system we were building, and there were lots and lots of fields that we needed lots of data for creating a new account or a user in this. But we were able to say, what's the bare minimum, what's the smallest set of data needed to create a user in the current state of the system, and reduced it down to that. We were able to deliver that story, show it all works, get it deployed, get our DevOps in place to deploy it, and then come back and start adding other fields to it. Another question to ask you, can you defer validation? So let's say you've got something like this, where we need to make sure the name's not invalid, or make sure the address isn't invalid, or I'm getting thumbs down here, make sure the account history isn't invalid. In a lot of systems, particularly something where you've got workflow, you're going to be in a situation where you need to go through several screens, and you may want it to validate as the user types information in. And then when you get ready to submit it to the database, you're going to validate that information again to make sure that everything's okay before you send it to the database. So if you need to split a story, you may be a lot better off leaving off the validation that's happening in real time in order to get something that lets the overall flow work and give it to the customer and let them see what they think of it. Because if for some reason you find out that they work their way through it and they say, yeah, we don't need to do this. So if we were to defer validation, what happens? Can the customer provide feedback on the process without validation? And the answer oftentimes is yes, they can. Now, you may want validation. It may be the next most important thing you work on, but getting to where you can actually create the user probably provides more value than getting to create, and getting that sooner is probably going to be more valuable than doing the validation and the creation together. For example, what if the customer decides they don't need to create users? So you go through this flow and they go in and do it and they're like, hey, you know what? We just discovered we don't need to create users at all. Maybe we just realized we can pull them all out of an existing system. So this flow doesn't actually need to happen. The chances of them discovering that when you've actually showed them here's how we're going to create users, or deciding that they wanted to choose to do this, are much higher probably than them just coming up with it on their own. So this idea of deferring validation, of just saying, and I saw some thumbs down here on stuff. So let me be clear. I'm not saying defer validation, meaning you don't do validation, but getting that feedback sooner, if deciding to build it first without validation lets us get that feedback and increases our chances that we may decide we don't need to do other stories, it's probably worth it. Now, the danger here is obviously if we say we're going to defer validation and we're never going to get to it and it makes for a really bad user experience, that might not be a good thing. But that's where, if we're working in smaller batches, we ought to be able to prioritize things better. And maybe validation, when we get to the point that that validation is more important than anything else we could do, that's probably the time that would be best to do it. Simplifying the workflow. So let's say you got a workflow like this. Oh, that didn't lay out quite right. We take the user info, we take their account info, we get some optional info based on those other fields, more optional info, we show them a summary, then we submit it and do a confirmation, and then eventually that shows up in the list of accounts that we've created. Well, it might make sense. We might be able to create a smaller story that just takes the user account information, whatever needs to, we throw it on that page, just the minimal data that we need. We skip all this and jump over to the confirmation. We just submit it and go straight to the confirmation. That might not be a bad first story to get feedback and to show the customer what we're doing and to test things out if we need to split things down. That's a good way to make sure that we've got the overall thing. A user can create something that shows up on confirmation, and then we can show it in the list of accounts, even though we want to add these other pieces. And those can be individual stories that provide value to the user. Can you defer confirmation? So there's another question we should ask ourselves about splitting stories. So in this type of flow right here, what if we were to kind of even skip the confirmation and just make it when you create a user account, we take them directly to the list of accounts to show them everything that's there, assuming this is like an admin screen or something like that. That might not be a bad just step to get to the point that the system does something, because now we've got users in the system, which might enable a bunch of other developers that are working on things that are dependent on us just being able to create a user. Can you defer one of the inputs or interfaces? So this was an example from a group I worked with. They had a holiday schedule in the system that would decide what could happen based on what the holiday schedules were for federal holidays. And one of the things that they wanted is a holiday UI where they could go in and create all these holidays. And it was very important, something that they definitely wanted. However, when they started really prioritizing and saying, what do we really need? They're like, okay, we need the holidays to work. That needs to function. But the holiday UI, we could just go ahead and load that from a CSV file and we'd be good for a year. So if we can just load this from a CSV file and have the holiday schedule functionality working correctly, the holiday UI is a lot lower priority than other things that would keep us from being able to launch the system. So in this case, they were able to launch the system without the holiday UI interface that they wanted, and they went back and built it later, but it put them in a position that they were able to get the software up and running and delivered sooner because they had deferred something that was with CSV file. They were able to get to the state they needed for the next year or two. They could have even kept on doing that if they had wanted. Can you process just part of an input? So consider you've got a file with lots of different data in it, right? We've got header and then a bunch of records and then a summary at the end. Could we start just with the header, right? Can we have a story that just starts showing the user what we're going to do with the header? So this might be a matter of it takes the header and lists it out that here's the files we've received. It's a very small thing, but it's a step forward of splitting this story of everything that we could possibly want to do with this file. Next, maybe add the summary total. So maybe this sums these things up and checks the summary. Maybe we ignore everything that's in the header except for just make sure that the summary works. And now we've got another step forward in what we need. But we're able to deliver that, show it to the customer, get feedback, show them how it works, and enable other pieces that might be give ourselves options on what we work on next. We might find that once we just get this done and have the total, it lets us work on some other piece of it that's really important to lower the risk of how we're delivering this for the customer. Okay, so join that. We're going to try the competitive quiz thing in the Slido, see how that works. But take a look at this. I want to show you this. This is one of the links in the Slido thing. This is Agile for All. This is a flow chart to try to figure out how to split stuff. I highly recommend taking a look at it. In the Slido thing, there's a link there to this. It's a PDF. Download it, save it somewhere, and next time you're looking at a story and trying to find a way to split it, obviously remember the stuff we've talked about, but take a look at these, because some of these are really good ways just to make sure that you're not overlooking a way to split a story that might be just looking at your face. Summary total, maybe somebody pointed out that I may have done math wrong on that last thing. Well, then it should fail, right? That's what we want to find out, is it fails if it doesn't work. Somebody said they use this on their training for stuff. So this is great. This is a really helpful thing to split.